sent this a little late. Some of you got to read what I wrote you today, which is the outline for this unit. If you didn't, well, I'm going to go over it now anyway, but then do look at it later, because in fact, every one of these documents I give you is a narrative, just like what we're talking about. It's organized in a certain way that gives you the idea of what are the main points in this. And I say that for the last unit that we just finished also, where it was really an outline of the points, that each of these unit assignments that I write down for you is the equivalent of an essay question on the second exam, right? So it's already there in a way. The last one for Unit 8, I made it a little bit different, what we did on Monday, for those of you who were here, which was not just over Unit 8. Remember, I told you we had to skip a little bit. And so instead I made that be all the way, since Unit 8 was supposed to be women in the public sphere and what is done to them, we kind of reviewed all the ways that women can be put down linguistically, from mansplaining to bitch discourse on the shorter level to the larger level. And so I organized that a little bit different. So the handout for Monday, which was for Unit 8, was really an overview of earlier things, where normally, as I said, the first test, it's not covered again, but there are little bits and pieces that come in the second part. Okay, so let's forget about that for the moment. You can ask me, we can go back to questions on that last one. You should go over that, in fact, what we did on Monday, and if you still have questions on that, bring that in on Monday, treating it as if it were an essay question, okay? Like you see how we did the essay questions. We had subcategories that you could choose from. Okay. So this is the essay question on gendered narratives. And then we have of desire. So the first word is narrative, or stories, or storytelling. So the first thing we're going to look at, you see we have 4 parts, is why do people tell stories all the time? Before we get into the gendered thing, why are stories so important? And the first piece I sent you today that's not in your packet, and you don't have to read it. I'll just give you the key words, but I always like you to have it in case you don't understand something and you want to go over it, or in case somebody wants to do a paper on narratives. Any of you who are more literature-oriented, in fact, and maybe you didn't like the blue paper you did, or you're afraid of too much linguistics, there are a lot of topics in this unit you could do that fit our criteria of being linguistic, but yet they are discourse-oriented, they're storytelling, okay? So the first unit will be just talking about first, what is a narrative storytelling? Why is it has always been in life totally important, always, for humanity? But of course, since this course is about gender, then we're going to look even more, not just at all narratives. The very first item I'm going to give you, we're just going to talk about why people are always telling stories or myths, or whatever, in their personal lives, in gossiping, in telling stories, in writing novels later, etc. Sort of what you've tried to talk about in your paper a little bit, right? All that. So the stories have always been there. But now we're going to look particularly at gendered stories, both how, starting with heterosexuals, how males and females tell stories, that everyday stories, and that's why our first big article is going to be about courtship narratives. Because everybody has a story about how they got married, or if they didn't, how it failed that they didn't get married, or whatever, right? So all the family, courtship, divorce stories, all those stories that people tell, and you think, oh, well, you tell it the way it was. But no, how do you tell it? You tell it within that same cognitive framework that's hardwired in your brain there, right? But you're not totally aware of it. Even if you're a feminist, and you think, oh, I'm beyond all that. And we're going to see that, our main required article, there are 2. One I told you to read, but we're actually going to do another one first, which you should look at afterwards, but if you didn't read it now, it's okay. And it talks about how people in 3 generations talk about their courtships. And the central word will be the keyword vocabulary of motive. That is how people will define all that, how people tell their stories without realizing it in these boxes of how you are supposed to tell stories. For example, I'm sure none of you have a grandmother who told you a story, oh yeah, I got knocked up and that's why I got married, right? Nobody's grandmother told you that. How many of them do you think got knocked up? Give me a percentage. No, there are statistics on this, and I'll tell you how we know it.
25.
50 at least, yeah. I mean, of course, it can be any of those in a different social class or area. And how do we know that figure? Because they did, not all over the world, so that's why it varies, but where they did it, around 1900, not even yesterday. I mean, yesterday doesn't matter. Half of today in France, that article we read about changing the last names, that they could give the female last name to the kid, and it had the statistic even 10 years ago that 50% of kids were born out of wedlock. But I'm not talking about out of wedlock now. I'm talking about your grandmother who got married, right? And they don't tell you the story, so they did studies in Europe on people who got married in the early part of the last century. So if they weren't even modern. And how did they test this? They looked at their marriage date and the first child born. And unless their 50% of children are all premature babies, born after 6 months or 5 months or whatever, so that's one of the ways of having the test. Okay, so that's the vocabulary of motive. There are some things that you can't tell at all. And there are other things you have to put in your story because that's expected for you to perform your femaleness and so forth, okay? So the first part then is, what is a narrative and why do we need it? And then within that, gendered narrative, starting with courtship stories. But if we have courtship stories, we have divorce stories too, because that's another part of it. Okay, so that's the first part. The second part is contrasting, and contrasting specifically women's versus men's storytelling, particularly in everyday talk. We're not talking about novelists, how they write. That's a bigger issue, sort of everyday talk, and how in that everyday talk, now we've seen some of that already. The president of Harvard would fit in there, right? That she's doing, I'm performing female, and I've got to perform female extra heavily because I'm the president of Harvard, so I'm up there, but then I'm going to be taken for some ball-busting lesbian or something. So I'm going to be cutesy Southern woman, and I'm going to say, I don't know how this happened. Okay, so we're going to see more stuff like that, all put in one article about Greece, but with all kinds of statistics. So self-deprecation will be one of the things they'll show, but it has a lot of the things we've seen in the other articles, in the backstage talk and all that, but put together in a different way. So that's in the second part, and that's a big article by this woman, a Greek. You don't have to read that article, but you have the article there so you can look at some of the charts. So that's the second part, contrasting everyday storytelling in males and females, and the conclusion of that, because that article is about Greece, but it has data from elsewhere, and you've seen data from elsewhere, is something, a very, very big deal, a really big deal. And that is the, quote, the construction of different narrative worlds. That is, through the stories that they tell. Obviously, I'm not saying everybody does this at all times. It is the generalized people living in their boxes, cultural boxes, but it's not so easy to get out of those boxes. And what does that mean, construction of different narrative worlds? It means that the stories they tell, so supposedly what they see or choose to convey, it's as if it were two different places, as if they were living in two different places. So one example we'll see more is the women's stories, like what happened last week or what happened during the war, it doesn't matter. They will have more characters in the stories. Because how do we live? We live together, right? Not just one. And the male stories will be much more about what I did or something my buddy and I did when I broke the window. I'm simplifying the stories here, obviously. And this is, for the everyday stories, what happened last week at the bar. Or one of my areas, and I'm sorry I'm not able to torture you with more of my publications, because this is the area that I write in pre-modern versions of all of this, but also modern. I work also on Holocaust memoirs by women, survivor women. And you see there that in the stories of what happened to them in the concentration camps or wherever, they talk about and they name the fellow women they were with, and there is this community, and the males do that very much less and talk about how I achieved doing something, managing to do something there to survive. The women talk about survival too, of course, but in a different way. So they're telling about the same experience. In fact, the women's camps were worse than the men's camps. But the stories they tell about that same reality, of course, overlaps. But the way, the world that they create in those stories is different. And that is a very, very, very big thing to say. And that leads us to number three then, women's and men's sex talk. So now you want to get it together, especially two teenagers where neither one of them has any experience. And how do they talk about that, and what happens, and how do they negotiate? Are we going to do it or aren't we going to do it, and all that? If, in telling a story about what happened last week at the bar, we have the different narrative worlds, then in sex talk, we have that patriarchal language, we have the male sex drive language even more. And so that's why I said this is, where did I put it? Yes, this one, that's part 3, is the single most important article for you to read. Actually, this one is one of my favorite articles, but even if you don't read every word of it about the courtship narratives, and you skim it after you heard me talk about it, and it has a lot of examples, so you want to hear those, you can get by on it. But this one comes up with the idea of not just, this article said, what was the word again? Construction of different narrative worlds in sort of everyday stories. This one says, as they're trying to talk about having sex or not having sex, that they have a total lack of intersubjectivity, and we're going to define that, what that is. So that's sex talk, and a few more articles. And then the last one, I don't know how much we're going to get to next Monday, but it is also important to go beyond sex talk. It's still sex talk, which is part 4, erotica and porn. And how male erotica, first of all, what is erotica, what is porn to some degree, but more importantly, men for women and men for men is very different. So women read Harlequin romances, let's say. Men don't tend to read Harlequin romances. And if we get a chance, we'll talk about lesbian porn and gay porn also a little bit, and even gay romances and so forth. It's a lot of material, and we can't do all of that, obviously, but think of the 4 categories, and that will help you digest what I'm going to try to say. Also, I want to repeat that some of these things I mentioned in parentheses, I'm going to just say one sentence about, but they become very useful for anybody who's still thinking of picking a new subject or whatever, okay? So, the first one, the first question then is the article that you don't have to read that I just sent you today by Saltmarsh 2018 that talks about, it has a funny title, using story to change systems. What that means is that storytelling, among many other things, is a way to change the future in a way, or that it can have cultural and political purpose. So our main example of that would be that transgender coming out stories or transgender narratives. Why are they so important, and why are we going to talk about it in the last unit? Did anybody talk about transgender narratives 80 years ago? Did it even exist? I'm not talking about people who felt this way. I'm talking about written texts talking about it. Actually, historically, there were some in historical accounts, but it wasn't a thing in the culture. The fact that now it is more open and a thing, what does it say? It says that, first of all, that some people can use stories to come to have a different identity. So a creation of a different identity, like you change your name. We've talked about name change, right? So by telling your story, you have, and they're also very important, because if we look at the stories in Silverstein by the 3 generation of heterosexual people in 2 families, and they talk about courtship stories, those are all standard, what the society wants you to be. They want you to get married, have 2 kids, have a heterosexual marriage, right? So those people are telling stories that the society is saying, yes, tell this story, and repeat the story, and repeat the story, just like those proverbs. You got to repeat it, because that you're telling the story, you're taking part linguistically in repeating the hegemonic laws. The person who's telling the transgender story is telling a different story that's going against the hegemonic stories. And that's